Sarah Martinez stood behind the weapons counter at Camp Liberty, her uniform crisp despite the desert heat that seemed to seep through every crack in the building. The morning sun cast long shadows across the concrete floor as soldiers lined up for their daily equipment checks. At 28, she had been managing the armory for 3 years, but to most of the personnel who passed through, she was just another face behind the counter. The dismissive glances weren't new. Sarah had grown accustomed to the way some soldiers looked right through her, as if she were merely part of the furniture. They would approach her station with barely concealed impatience, drumming their fingers on the counter while she processed their requests with methodical precision. Some would even ask if there was someone else who could help them, someone with more authority. Lieutenant Jackson was particularly notorious for his attitude. He would swagger up to her counter with his chest puffed out, speaking slowly as if she couldn't understand basic military terminology. Today was no different. He approached with his usual air of superiority, his boots clicking loudly on the floor to announce his presence. "I need to check out night vision equipment for my unit," he said, not bothering with pleasantries. His tone suggested he was doing her a favor by even acknowledging her existence. Sarah pulled up his file on her computer, her fingers moving quickly across the keyboard. "I see here that your unit already has 3 sets checked out. The regulation clearly states that each unit can only have a maximum of 3 sets without special authorization." Jackson's face flushed red. "Look, I don't think you understand the urgency of our mission. We need that equipment tonight." "I understand perfectly," Sarah replied calmly, her voice steady despite the growing tension. "However, I need proper authorization from your commanding officer before I can release additional equipment. It's standard protocol." The lieutenant leaned forward, his voice dropping to what he probably thought was an intimidating whisper. "Listen here, supply clerk. I've been in this army longer than you've been alive. I know what I need, and I need it now." Sarah's jaw tightened slightly, but her professional demeanor never wavered. She had dealt with men like Jackson countless times before. They assumed that because she worked behind a counter, she didn't understand the complexities of military operations. They had no idea about her background, her training, or the real reason she had been assigned to this particular position. "Sir, I'm not just a supply clerk," she said, her voice remaining level. "I'm the armory manager, and I take my responsibilities seriously. The equipment you're requesting requires proper documentation. If you'd like to speak with my supervisor about this matter, I can arrange that for you." Jackson straightened up, his eyes narrowing. "Your supervisor? Who exactly would that be? Because I'm pretty sure I outrank anyone who would be supervising supply personnel." Before Sarah could respond, Sergeant Williams from Jackson's unit appeared at the counter. Williams had always treated Sarah with respect, and she could see the embarrassment in his eyes as he witnessed his lieutenant's behavior. "Sir," Williams interjected carefully, "perhaps we could come back with the proper authorization. It shouldn't take too long to get the paperwork sorted." Jackson spun around, his frustration now directed at his subordinate. "Are you questioning my judgment, Sergeant?" "No, sir, I'm just suggesting that we follow proper channels to avoid any delays." The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Other soldiers in line were beginning to take notice of the commotion, some stepping back to avoid getting caught in the crossfire. Sarah remained calm, her hands folded neatly on the counter, waiting for the situation to resolve itself. Jackson turned back to Sarah, his voice rising. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge of this operation. This is ridiculous. We have important work to do and we're being held up by bureaucratic nonsense." "I am in charge of this operation," Sarah replied quietly. "This is my armory and these are my rules. They exist for the safety and security of all personnel on this base." The lieutenant's laugh was harsh and mocking. "Your armory? That's rich. Look, sweetheart, I don't know what kind of authority you think you have, but I guarantee you that when I speak to your real boss, this whole situation is going to be resolved very quickly." Sarah felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had been through this dance before countless times. The assumptions, the condescension, the absolute certainty that she couldn't possibly be qualified for her position. What these men didn't know was that her assignment to this armory wasn't random. It wasn't because she was good with inventory, or because she had a pleasant demeanor with difficult customers. The truth was far more complex and infinitely more important than any of them realized. Sarah Martinez wasn't just managing weapons and equipment. She was overseeing one of the most critical operations on the entire base, something that went far beyond simple supply management. Her background in intelligence analysis and strategic operations had made her the perfect candidate for this assignment. But that information was classified at levels that most of the personnel she dealt with would never reach. As Jackson continued his tirade, Sarah's mind wandered to the briefing she had received just that morning. There had been chatter about possible security threats, intelligence suggesting that someone might be trying to infiltrate their supply lines. Her position at the armory wasn't just about managing inventory. It was about monitoring every single transaction, looking for patterns that might indicate hostile activity. The irony wasn't lost on her. While Jackson stood there questioning her authority and competence, she was simultaneously running a sophisticated analysis of equipment requests, cross-referencing them with intelligence reports, and monitoring for any signs of unusual activity. Her computer screen showed far more than simple inventory management software. Hidden behind the standard interface was a complex system that tracked everything from usage patterns to personnel behavior. Williams cleared his throat nervously. "Sir, maybe we should just come back later with the proper documentation." Jackson's response was cut short by the sound of heavy boots approaching rapidly from the corridor. The distinctive rhythm indicated someone moving with purpose and urgency. Sarah's trained ear immediately recognized the cadence as military leadership, someone with significant rank and responsibility. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off the concrete walls of the armory. Other soldiers in the area began to straighten their posture instinctively, sensing the approach of senior authority. Jackson paused mid-sentence, his attention drawn to the approaching sound. Sarah felt her pulse quicken slightly. She had been expecting this moment, though she hadn't known exactly when it would come. The morning's intelligence briefing had hinted at developments that would require immediate action. Her cover as a simple armory manager was about to be tested in ways that none of these soldiers could imagine. The sound of the approaching footsteps grew closer, and Sarah could feel the entire atmosphere in the armory beginning to shift. Whatever was about to happen would change everything, and she knew that her carefully maintained facade was about to be shattered. The door to the armory burst open with such force that it slammed against the wall, causing several soldiers to jump. Commander Robert Hayes stood in the doorway, his chest heaving as if he had been running. His uniform was slightly disheveled, and there was a look of barely controlled urgency in his eyes that made everyone in the room stand straighter. Hayes was not a man who showed panic easily. At 52, he had served in 3 different conflicts and had earned a reputation for maintaining his composure under the most extreme circumstances. Seeing him in this state sent a ripple of anxiety through the assembled soldiers. His eyes swept across the room quickly, taking in the scene before him. Lieutenant Jackson was still standing at the counter, his mouth half open from whatever complaint he had been voicing. Sergeant Williams looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The other soldiers in line had frozen in place, unsure whether they should salute, retreat, or simply wait for instructions. But Commander Hayes wasn't looking at any of them. His gaze had locked onto Sarah Martinez, who stood calmly behind the weapons counter as if nothing unusual was happening. The contrast between her serene demeanor and the commander's obvious agitation was striking. "Agent Martinez," Hayes said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I need your immediate assessment of the situation." The words hung in the air for a moment, their implications slowly sinking into the minds of everyone present. Agent Martinez. Not Specialist Martinez, not Sergeant Martinez. Agent Jackson's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession. Confusion gave way to disbelief, which then transformed into something approaching horror as the reality of what he had just heard began to register. He looked back and forth between Sarah and the commander, his mind struggling to process this new information. Sarah's response was immediate and professional. "Sir, I've been monitoring all equipment transactions as instructed. The anomalies we discussed this morning have continued to develop. I have 3 separate incidents that require your immediate attention." She moved with practiced efficiency, pulling up files on her computer that none of the assembled soldiers had ever seen before. The screen that had appeared to show simple inventory management now displayed complex charts, analysis reports, and what looked like intelligence briefings. Hayes stepped forward, lowering his voice, but not enough that the others couldn't hear. "The situation has escalated beyond our initial projections. Washington wants a full briefing within the hour, and I need your analysis to make that happen." "Understood, sir. I'll have the complete report ready for transmission in 30 minutes. Sarah's voice carried an authority that nobody in the room had heard before. This wasn't the patient supply clerk who had been calmly explaining regulations just moments earlier. This was someone else entirely. Jackson found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. I don't understand what's happening here. Commander Hayes turned to look at him, and Jackson involuntarily took a step backward. The commander's expression was a mixture of irritation and something that might have been pity. Lieutenant Jackson, isn't it? Hayes said, though his tone suggested it wasn't really a question. I believe you were just questioning Agent Martinez's authority and competence. Jackson's mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish that had been suddenly pulled from water and thrown onto dry land. Sarah stepped out from behind the counter, and for the first time, the assembled soldiers could see her clearly without the barrier of the weapons desk between them. She moved with a confidence and purpose that seemed to transform her entire presence. Her posture was different, her expression had changed, and even the way she held her hands suggested someone trained for far more than inventory management. Sir, she addressed the commander, I recommend we clear the area for security purposes. The information I need to share with you is classified at levels that require appropriate clearance verification for all personnel present. Hayes nodded approvingly. Agreed. Lieutenant Jackson, Sergeant Williams, and the rest of you, I need this area cleared immediately. Any equipment requests can be processed later today through proper channels. The soldiers began to file out, their movements awkward and uncertain. They kept glancing back over their shoulders, trying to make sense of what they had just witnessed. Jackson seemed particularly reluctant to leave, his pride warring with his growing realization that he had made a serious error in judgment. Williams paused near the door and turned back toward Sarah. Ma'am, I just wanted to say that I'm sorry for any disrespect that may have been shown. It was inappropriate and unprofessional. Sarah nodded acknowledgement of his apology, her expression softening slightly. Thank you, Sergeant. I appreciate that. Jackson, however, couldn't seem to let it go. Even as Williams was trying to lead him toward the exit, he kept turning back, his face flushed with embarrassment and confusion. I still don't understand, he said loudly. How was I supposed to know? She's working behind a supply counter. How was anyone supposed to know she was some kind of secret agent? Commander Hayes stopped walking and turned to face Jackson directly. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lieutenant, that's exactly the point, Hayes said, his voice dangerously quiet. Agent Martinez's cover assignment was designed to be unobtrusive and unremarkable. The fact that she could operate effectively in that capacity while conducting critical intelligence operations is precisely why she was selected for this mission. He paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. Your assumptions about her capabilities based on her apparent position say more about your judgment than they do about her qualifications. I suggest you use this experience as an opportunity to examine those assumptions. Jackson's face went from red to pale in the span of seconds. He clearly wanted to say something in his defense, but the words wouldn't come. The magnitude of his mistake was becoming clearer with each passing moment. Sarah watched the exchange with professional detachment, but there was something in her eyes that suggested she had been through similar situations before. The dismissal, the condescension, the absolute certainty that she couldn't possibly be qualified for anything more challenging than basic administrative work. It was a pattern she had learned to use to her advantage. Sir, she said to Hayes, perhaps we should allow Lieutenant Jackson to remain for the initial briefing. His unit was requesting additional night vision equipment, and given the current security situation, he may need to understand why certain protocols have been implemented. Hayes considered this for a moment, then nodded. Very well. Lieutenant, you may stay, but understand that everything you hear in this room is classified. Any breach of that confidentiality will result in immediate court-martial proceedings. Jackson nodded quickly. His earlier arrogance completely evaporated. He moved to a corner of the room and stood at attention, clearly trying to make himself as inconspicuous as possible. Sarah returned to her computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she accessed systems that were clearly far more sophisticated than anything a typical supply clerk would use. The screen filled with data that looked more like something from a war room than an inventory management system. The pattern analysis is complete, she reported to Hayes. We have confirmation of organized infiltration attempts at 3 different levels. The equipment requests that initially seemed routine are actually part of a coordinated intelligence gathering operation. Hayes leaned forward, studying the data on her screen. How long have they been active? Based on the transaction patterns, at least 6 weeks. Possibly longer. They've been very subtle about it, spreading the requests across multiple units and time periods to avoid detection. Jackson listened to this exchange with growing amazement. The woman he had been dismissing as incompetent just minutes earlier was discussing complex intelligence operations with the base commander as if it were routine business. The realization of how badly he had misjudged the situation was beginning to settle in, along with the uncomfortable knowledge that his behavior had been witnessed by one of the most senior officers on the base. Commander Hayes pulled up a chair next to Sarah's workstation, his attention completely focused on the data streaming across her monitors. The sophisticated intelligence interface looked nothing like the simple inventory system that had been visible moments before. Charts, graphs, and complex algorithmic analyses filled multiple screens, painting a picture of coordinated espionage that ran much deeper than anyone had initially suspected. "Show me the Johnson requisition from last Tuesday," Hayes requested, pointing to a specific data point on one of the charts. Sarah's fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up detailed records that went far beyond simple equipment checkout logs. The file that appeared contained photographs, behavioral analysis notes, and cross-referenced data from multiple intelligence sources. Corporal Johnson requested thermal imaging equipment for what he claimed was a routine perimeter patrol, Sarah explained, her voice taking on the measured tone of a professional intelligence briefer. However, his unit wasn't scheduled for perimeter duty that week. More importantly, the thermal imaging equipment he specifically requested has capabilities that far exceed what would be needed for standard patrol operations. Jackson watched from his corner, struggling to reconcile the woman speaking with such authority with the person he had been dismissing just minutes earlier. Every assumption he had made about her competence and qualifications was crumbling before his eyes. Hayes nodded grimly. "And you believe this was part of the larger pattern we've been tracking?" "I'm certain of it," Sarah replied, pulling up another screen filled with interconnected diagrams that looked like something from a spy thriller. "Johnson's request fits perfectly with the intelligence profile we developed. The equipment he wanted would have given him the ability to map our entire perimeter security system from the inside." She paused, highlighting several connections on the diagram. "But here's where it gets really interesting. Johnson's request was approved by Lieutenant Morrison, who has also been showing unusual interest in our communications equipment inventory. And Morrison's authorization codes were used to access classified equipment manifests that he shouldn't have clearance to see." The commander leaned back in his chair, the full implications of what Sarah was telling him clearly weighing heavily on his mind. "How deep does this go?" "Based on my analysis, we're looking at a minimum of 7 personnel involved in coordinated intelligence gathering activities. Possibly more." Sarah's tone remained professional, but there was an underlying tension that suggested the scope of the problem was even larger than she was initially letting. Jackson found himself leaning forward despite his attempts to remain inconspicuous. The conversation he was witnessing was far beyond anything he had expected when he had walked into the armory that morning. The woman he had dismissed as a mere supply clerk was revealing a conspiracy that threatened the security of their entire operation. Hayes stood up and began pacing, his hands clasped behind his back. "Agent Martinez, I need your recommendation for immediate action. We can't let this continue, but we also can't tip them off that we've discovered their activities." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her eyes focused on the data displays as she considered the options. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the confidence of someone who had dealt with similar situations before. "I recommend we continue normal operations while implementing enhanced monitoring protocols. We need to let them think their activities are still undetected while we gather enough evidence to roll up the entire network." She turned to face Hayes directly. "The key is Johnson's next scheduled equipment request. According to his pattern, he should be back here within the next 48 hours asking for communication intercept equipment. If we handle that carefully, we can trace the information flow all the way back to whoever is running this operation." Hayes nodded approvingly. "Agreed, but we'll need additional support for the surveillance operation. I can't risk using personnel who might be compromised." "I've already identified clean assets we can use," Sarah replied, pulling up another file. Sergeant Williams has a spotless record and no connections to any of the suspected personnel. His unit could be briefed and deployed without raising suspicions. Jackson's head snapped up at the mention of Williams. His subordinate, who had been trying to calm the situation earlier, was being recommended for a critical intelligence operation. Meanwhile, Jackson himself was standing in the corner, having proven himself completely unaware of the sophisticated activities happening right under his nose. The realization of his own inadequacy in this situation was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. While he had been focused on asserting his authority over what he thought was a simple supply transaction, Sarah had been conducting complex intelligence analysis that was crucial to base security. Hayes pulled out his secure communication device. "I need to brief Washington immediately. Agent Martinez, can you have a complete intelligence package ready for transmission within the hour?" "Already prepared, sir," Sarah replied, gesturing to another monitor that displayed a comprehensive report. "I've been maintaining real-time documentation of all suspicious activities since we first identified the pattern 3 weeks ago." The commander paused in his preparations to look at her with something approaching admiration. 3 weeks? You've been tracking this for 3 weeks and maintained perfect operational security while conducting routine supply operations? "That's what I was trained to do, sir," Sarah replied simply. "The cover assignment allows me to monitor all equipment transactions while maintaining the appearance of routine administrative work. It's actually an ideal position for this type of operation." Jackson listened to this exchange with growing amazement and discomfort. Every minute of the conversation revealed another layer of complexity that he had been completely unaware of. The woman he had treated with such condescension was operating at levels of sophistication that he was only beginning to comprehend. Hayes began gathering the intelligence materials, his movements quick and efficient. "I need you to maintain normal operations while I brief headquarters. If anyone asks about my visit here, the official story is that I was conducting a routine security inspection of armory procedures." "Understood, sir," Sarah replied. "What about Lieutenant Jackson?" "He's heard classified information that goes well beyond his current clearance level." Hayes turned to look at Jackson, who suddenly felt very exposed in his corner of the room. The weight of both their gazes made him acutely aware of how drastically the situation had changed since he had walked through the armory door. "Lieutenant, Jackson will be temporarily reassigned to support operations under Agent Martinez's direction," Hayes said after a moment of consideration. "His unit's request for night vision equipment makes them a perfect cover for enhanced surveillance activities." Jackson's mouth fell open. He was being placed under the command of the woman he had been dismissing as incompetent just minutes earlier. The irony of the situation was not lost on him, and he could feel his face flushing with embarrassment. Sarah turned to address Jackson directly for the first time since the commander's arrival. When she spoke, her voice was professional but firm. "Lieutenant, your unit's equipment request actually fits perfectly with the surveillance operation we need to conduct. However, this will require you to follow operational protocols that may be different from standard military procedures. Are you prepared to take direction from intelligence personnel?" Jackson nodded quickly, though his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Sarah continued. "Your first assignment will be to brief Sergeant Williams on the new operational parameters without revealing the classified aspects of our investigation. He'll need to understand that equipment protocols have been enhanced for security reasons without knowing the specific intelligence concerns." Hayes gathered the last of his materials and headed toward the door. "Agent Martinez, I'll be back with additional resources within 4 hours. Lieutenant Jackson, you'll report to Agent Martinez for operational assignments until further notice." As the commander reached the door, he paused and turned back. "Lieutenant, I trust I don't need to emphasize the classified nature of everything you've heard here today." "No, sir." "Absolutely not, sir," Jackson replied, his voice shaking slightly. After Hayes left, the armory fell into an uncomfortable silence. Sarah returned to her workstation, but Jackson remained standing awkwardly in the corner, unsure of what he should do or say. The silence in the armory stretched uncomfortably as Sarah continued her work at the computer, her fingers moving efficiently across multiple keyboards, while data flowed across several monitors. Jackson remained frozen in place, watching her with a mixture of fascination and mortification. The transformation he had witnessed was so complete that he found himself questioning whether this was even the same person he had been arguing with minutes earlier. Finally, Sarah looked up from her screens and gestured toward a chair near her workstation. "Lieutenant Jackson, you might as well sit down. We have work to do, and standing in the corner isn't going to help either of us." Jackson moved hesitantly toward the chair, his usual swagger completely absent. He sat down carefully, as if afraid that any sudden movement might trigger another revelation that would further demolish his understanding of the situation. "I imagine you have questions," Sarah said, her tone more conversational than it had been during the intense briefing with Commander Hayes. Most people do when they discover that their assumptions about a situation were completely wrong. Jackson cleared his throat nervously. "Ma'am, I have to ask, how long have you been working intelligence operations?" Sarah saved the file she had been working on and turned to face him directly. "I've been with military intelligence for 8 years. This particular assignment has been ongoing for 6 months. 6 months, Jackson repeated, shaking his head. "You've been operating undercover for 6 months and nobody suspected anything?" "That was rather the point," Sarah replied with a slight smile. "The best intelligence operations are the ones that nobody notices are happening. People see what they expect to see, and they expect to see a supply clerk behind a weapons counter." Jackson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I keep thinking about all the times I've been in here, all the conversations I've had in front of you, all the things I might have said without realizing. Lieutenant, you've never said or done anything that would compromise operational security," Sarah said, though her tone suggested she had indeed been monitoring such things. "However, your behavior today does raise some concerns about operational awareness that we need to address." She pulled up a new file on her computer, one that appeared to contain behavioral analysis reports on various base personnel. Jackson's name was prominently featured, along with detailed observations about his interactions and decision-making patterns. "Your tendency to dismiss personnel based on their apparent positions rather than their actual qualifications represents a significant security vulnerability," Sarah continued, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering a professional assessment. "Intelligence operations depend on people making exactly those kinds of assumptions." Jackson felt his face growing hot with embarrassment. "I realize now that I made some very poor judgments." "It's not just about poor judgment," Sarah replied, highlighting sections of text on her screen. "It's about the fact that your assumptions made you predictable, and predictable personnel are vulnerable personnel." She turned the monitor so Jackson could see his own behavioral profile. The level of detail was startling. Detailed observations about his interactions with different types of personnel, analysis of his decision-making patterns, and assessments of his potential security risks. "You've been watching me this whole time," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been watching everyone," Sarah corrected. "That's what intelligence officers do. We observe, we analyze, we look for patterns that might indicate security threats or operational vulnerabilities." Jackson stared at the screen, reading observations about himself that were uncomfortably accurate. His tendency to dismiss support personnel, his preference for asserting authority rather than following proper procedures, his assumption that rank automatically equated to knowledge and competence. It was all documented with clinical precision. "The good news," Sarah continued, "is that your behavioral patterns, while problematic, don't suggest any intentional security violations. You're not trying to compromise operations. You're just not very good at recognizing when operations are more complex than they appear." Jackson looked up from the screen. "What does this mean for my career?" Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "That depends entirely on how well you adapt to this new information. The fact that Commander Hayes is allowing you to remain involved in this operation suggests that he believes you can learn from this experience." She pulled up another file, this one containing detailed intelligence on the suspected infiltration network. "Your unit's equipment requests actually put you in a unique position to help with this investigation, but it's going to require you to think very differently about how operations work around here." Jackson studied the complex diagrams and analysis reports displayed on Sarah's monitors. The sophistication of the intelligence operation was overwhelming, but he was beginning to understand how his earlier behavior had demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that made such operations possible. "The people we're investigating," he said slowly, "they were counting on personnel like me not paying attention to the bigger picture." "Exactly," Sarah replied, looking pleased that he was beginning to understand. "They were counting on people seeing routine equipment requests and routine supply transactions. never realizing that those routine activities were actually part of a coordinated intelligence gathering operation. She highlighted several data points on one of her charts. Johnson's request for thermal imaging equipment wasn't suspicious by itself. Morrison's interest in communications equipment wasn't unusual for someone in his position. The pattern only became clear when you looked at all the activities together and analyzed them in the context of broader intelligence indicators. Jackson was quiet for several minutes, absorbing the implications of what she was telling him. Finally, he looked up at her with an expression that was equal parts admiration and chagrin. "I have to ask, when I was standing here arguing with you about regulations and procedures, what were you thinking?" Sarah's smile was rueful. "I was thinking that you were providing perfect cover for the classified activities I was conducting. Your focus on routine supply procedures helped maintain the impression that nothing unusual was happening in this armory." The irony of the situation hit Jackson like a physical blow. His dismissive attitude and focus on asserting his authority had actually served as camouflage for sophisticated intelligence operations. While he had been complaining about bureaucratic procedures, Sarah had been analyzing threats to national security. "There's something else you need to understand," Sarah continued, her tone becoming more serious. "The investigation we're conducting involves personnel at multiple levels of the command structure. Some of the people involved in this infiltration network may be individuals you know and work with regularly." Jackson felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying there are traitors in my unit?" "I'm saying we don't know yet how extensive this network is," Sarah replied carefully. "That's why we need to proceed with extreme caution. The people we're investigating have access to classified information and operational procedures. They know how our security systems work, and they've been using that knowledge to avoid detection." She pulled up another screen showing communication intercepts and financial records that painted a picture of sophisticated espionage activities. "This isn't amateur hour, Lieutenant. We're dealing with professional intelligence operatives who have been planning this infiltration for months, possibly years." Jackson stared at the evidence displayed on Sarah's monitors, finally beginning to comprehend the true scope of what he had stumbled into. His routine visit to request equipment had inadvertently revealed a complex intelligence operation that threatened the security of their entire base. "What do you need me to do?" he asked, his voice steady for the first time since Commander Hayes had burst through the door. Sarah studied him for a moment, as if evaluating whether he was truly prepared for what she was about to tell him. "I need you to go back to your unit and act as if nothing unusual happened here today. Your behavior needs to be completely normal, completely predictable." She paused, emphasizing the importance of what she was saying. "The success of this entire operation depends on the infiltration network believing that their activities remain undetected. If they suspect that we're onto them, they'll disappear, and we'll lose our chance to identify everyone involved." Jackson nodded, understanding beginning to dawn. "You're using me as bait." "I'm using your predictable behavior patterns as cover for our investigation," Sarah corrected. "Your unit's routine activities will provide the perfect excuse for enhanced surveillance operations." 3 days after the revelation in the armory, Jackson found himself in the most uncomfortable position of his military career. He was sitting in his unit's briefing room, watching Corporal Johnson request additional communication equipment with the knowledge that Johnson was likely a foreign intelligence operative. Every word, every gesture, every seemingly innocent question now carried sinister implications that Jackson had never noticed before. Johnson appeared completely relaxed as he presented his equipment request to the assembled personnel. His manner was casual and professional, exactly what Jackson would have expected from a competent soldier requesting standard gear for an upcoming mission. But now, armed with Sarah's intelligence briefing, Jackson could see subtle signs that he had never noticed before. The way Johnson's eyes lingered just a moment too long on classified deployment schedules displayed on the wall. How he steered conversations toward operational details that weren't directly relevant to his stated mission requirements. The casual questions about other units' equipment allocations that seemed friendly, but were actually sophisticated intelligence-gathering techniques. Sergeant Williams sat next to Jackson, completely unaware of the drama unfolding before them. Williams treated Johnson with the same professional courtesy he showed all personnel, never suspecting that routine military interactions were actually cover for espionage activities. Jackson envied Williams's ignorance even as he recognized the terrible responsibility he now carried. After the briefing, Johnson approached Jackson with a request that made the lieutenant's blood run cold. "Sir, I was wondering if you could help me with something. I need to coordinate with the communications section about upgrading our radio encryption protocols. Do you know who I should talk to about getting access to the new frequency allocation charts?" Jackson's mind raced as he tried to remember Sarah's instructions about maintaining normal behavior while gathering intelligence. The request sounded reasonable on the surface, but he now knew that frequency allocation charts would give Johnson exactly the kind of information a foreign intelligence service would need to intercept their communications. "I'll have to check on that for you." "Corporal," Jackson replied, hoping his voice sounded normal. "That kind of information requires special authorization procedures." Johnson nodded agreeably, but Jackson caught a brief flash of something in his eyes that might have been frustration or calculation. It was there for just an instant before being replaced by the same professional demeanor that had fooled everyone for months. "Of course, sir. I understand the security protocols. I just want to make sure our unit has the most current information for the upcoming deployment." After Johnson left, Jackson sat alone in the briefing room, overwhelmed by the weight of what he had just witnessed. The casual ease with which Johnson had attempted to gather classified information was chilling. Even more disturbing was the realization that similar requests had probably been made dozens of times before, and Jackson had never thought twice about them. Williams returned to the briefing room, carrying coffee and wearing an expression of mild confusion. "Sir, I've been thinking about the new equipment protocols we discussed yesterday. Some of the procedures seem more complex than they need to be for routine operations." Jackson chose his words carefully, remembering Sarah's emphasis on maintaining operational security. "The enhanced protocols are coming from higher up the chain of command. Apparently, there are security concerns that require additional documentation for certain types of equipment." "Security concerns about our own personnel?" Williams asked, his voice dropping slightly. Jackson realized that Williams was more observant than he had given him credit for. The sergeant had noticed changes in routine, procedures, and was smart enough to recognize that they indicated something more serious than routine administrative updates. "Let's just say that security protocols are being reviewed across the entire base," Jackson replied carefully. "I need you to make sure that all equipment requests go through proper channels, no exceptions." Williams nodded, but Jackson could see questions forming in his eyes. The sergeant was clearly trying to piece together the significance of the changes he had observed, and Jackson knew it was only a matter of time before Williams started asking more direct questions. That evening, Jackson found himself back in the armory, ostensibly conducting a routine equipment inventory, but actually participating in what Sarah had described as a critical intelligence gathering operation. The armory appeared to be conducting normal business, but Jackson now knew that every transaction was being monitored and analyzed for signs of suspicious activity. Sarah worked at her computer with the same calm efficiency she had displayed during their first encounter, but Jackson could now see the sophisticated intelligence analysis happening behind her professional demeanor. Multiple monitors displayed real-time data feeds, communication intercepts, and behavioral analysis reports that painted a complex picture of ongoing espionage activities. "Johnson made contact today," Jackson reported quietly, keeping his voice low, even though they were alone in the secure facility. "He requested information about frequency allocation charts and radio encryption protocols." Sarah's fingers paused over her keyboard for just a moment before continuing their rapid movement across the keys. "That's exactly what we expected." "Did he specify why he needed the information?" "He claimed it was for the upcoming deployment, but the way he asked the questions made it clear he was fishing for more information than he actually needed." Sarah pulled up Johnson's profile on one of her monitors, adding Jackson's observations to an already extensive file. "His behavior pattern is consistent with previous intelligence assessments. He's becoming more aggressive in his information gathering, which suggests his handlers are pressuring him for results." Jackson studied the data displayed on Sarah's screens, still amazed by the level of detail that had been compiled about personnel he thought he knew well. "How long do you think this has been going on?" "Based on the communication patterns we've intercepted, at least 18 months, Sarah replied, highlighting several data points that showed a gradual escalation in suspicious activities. The operation was very carefully planned and executed. They've been building relationships, establishing trust, and gradually expanding their access to classified information. The scope of the infiltration was staggering. Jackson realized that while he had been focused on routine military operations, a sophisticated espionage network had been systematically compromising the security of their entire installation. The fact that he had been completely unaware of these activities was both humbling and terrifying. "There's something else you need to know," Sarah continued, her tone becoming more serious. "We've identified at least 3 other personnel who appear to be connected to Johnson's activities. One of them is Lieutenant Morrison from the communications section." Jackson felt his stomach drop. Morrison was someone he had worked with regularly, someone he had considered a competent and trustworthy officer. The idea that Morrison might be involved in espionage activities challenged everything Jackson thought he knew about evaluating personnel. Morrison has been using his position to access communication, logs and deployment schedules that aren't related to his official duties, Sarah explained, pulling up files that documented Morrison's suspicious activities. He's also been asking questions about security protocols that go well beyond his need to know. Jackson stared at the evidence displayed on Sarah's monitors, trying to reconcile the Morrison he knew with the profile of a potential foreign intelligence operative. "I've worked with Morrison dozens of times. He seemed completely normal, completely professional." "That's what made him effective," Sarah replied. "The best intelligence operatives don't act suspicious or draw attention to themselves. They blend in perfectly with their surroundings and use their legitimate positions to gather information that appears routine but is actually highly valuable to foreign intelligence services." She pulled up a communication intercept that showed coded messages being transmitted from the base to external recipients. The technical sophistication of the operation was impressive, involving encrypted communications, dead drops, and carefully coordinated information transfers that had avoided detection for months. "The network we're dealing with represents a significant intelligence threat," Sarah continued. "They've had access to deployment schedules, communication protocols, and security procedures that could compromise operations far beyond this installation." Jackson absorbed this information with growing alarm. The casual conversations he had participated in, the routine briefings he had attended, the standard operational procedures he had followed, all of it had potentially been observed and analyzed by hostile intelligence operatives. "What's our next move?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he was prepared for the answer. Sarah saved her current work and turned to face him directly. "Tomorrow, Johnson is scheduled to submit a formal request for the communication equipment he discussed with you today. We're going to approve that request and provide him with modified equipment that will allow us to monitor his activities." She paused, emphasizing the critical nature of what she was about to tell him. "Your role in this operation is crucial, Lieutenant. Johnson trusts you, and he believes you're unaware of his real agenda. We need you to maintain that relationship while gathering intelligence about his contacts and activities." Jackson realized that his earlier dismissive attitude toward Sarah had inadvertently prepared him for this moment. His inability to recognize the sophisticated intelligence operation happening around him had made him the perfect candidate for an undercover role. The same blind spots that had caused him to underestimate Sarah's capabilities would now help him convince Johnson that he remained oblivious to the espionage activities. The modified communication equipment sat in Jackson's office like a time bomb waiting to expose an entire espionage network. Sarah had briefed him extensively on the device's capabilities. It appeared to function exactly like standard military radio equipment, but every transmission would be monitored and recorded by intelligence personnel. Johnson had no idea that his request for upgraded communications gear was about to become the key to unraveling months of carefully planned intelligence operations. Jackson tried to maintain his normal routine as he waited for Johnson to arrive, but the weight of the operation made even routine tasks feel significant. Every conversation, every interaction, every seemingly innocent exchange now carried the potential to reveal crucial intelligence about the infiltration network that had been operating under their noses for over a year. When Johnson finally appeared in Jackson's office, his demeanor was exactly what it had always been: professional, competent, and completely trustworthy. The casual way he requested the communication equipment showed no hint of the sophisticated espionage activities that Sarah's intelligence analysis had revealed. "Sir, I wanted to follow up on our conversation about the communication upgrades," Johnson said, settling into the chair across from Jackson's desk. "Have you been able to coordinate with the appropriate sections about getting access to the new equipment?" Jackson had rehearsed this moment multiple times with Sarah, but actually executing the plan was more nerve-wracking than he had anticipated. Johnson's easy confidence and apparent sincerity made it difficult to remember that this routine interaction was actually a critical intelligence operation. "I've got good news for you, Corporal," Jackson replied, gesturing toward the modified equipment that sat innocuously on a side table. "The communications section was able to expedite your request. The new radio system you requested is ready for deployment." Johnson's eyes lit up with what appeared to be genuine enthusiasm. "That's excellent, sir. This equipment will really improve our operational capabilities during the upcoming deployment." Jackson watched Johnson examine the equipment, looking for any sign that the corporal suspected the modifications that had been made. But Johnson's inspection appeared routine and professional, focusing on the technical specifications and operational features that would be relevant to legitimate military activities. "The frequency range on this unit is impressive," Johnson commented, studying the technical documentation that had been provided with the equipment. "It should give us much better communication flexibility in the field." What Johnson didn't know was that the improved frequency range included capabilities that would allow intelligence personnel to monitor every transmission he made. The equipment would function exactly as advertised for legitimate communications, but it would also record and transmit copies of all messages to Sarah's monitoring station in the armory. "There is one administrative requirement," Jackson said, following the script that Sarah had provided. "The new equipment requires enhanced documentation procedures for security purposes. You'll need to log all usage and provide regular reports on communication activities." Johnson nodded without hesitation. "Of course, sir. I understand the security protocols for advanced equipment. I'll make sure all documentation requirements are met." Jackson felt a chill as he realized how smoothly Johnson accepted requirements that would actually help intelligence personnel track his espionage activities. The corporal's willingness to comply with documentation procedures showed either remarkable confidence in his operational security or a complete lack of awareness about the sophistication of the investigation that was closing in around him. After Johnson left with the modified equipment, Jackson sat alone in his office, overwhelmed by the complexity of the situation he had become involved in. Just a week earlier, his biggest concern had been asserting his authority over routine supply procedures. Now he was participating in a counterintelligence operation that could potentially expose foreign agents operating at the highest levels of their command structure. His secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Sarah. "Package delivered successfully. Monitor normal communications for any changes in behavior patterns. Report any unusual activities immediately." Jackson realized that his role in the operation was far from over. Johnson would now be using the modified equipment for whatever espionage activities he was conducting, and Jackson would need to maintain his cover while gathering intelligence about those activities. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. His earlier inability to recognize sophisticated operations happening around him had now made him a valuable asset in exposing those same operations. That evening, Jackson found himself studying personnel files with a new perspective. Names and faces that had once seemed completely familiar now carried question marks. How many other Johnsons were there? How many other Morrisons had been using their legitimate positions to gather intelligence for hostile foreign services? The behavioral analysis techniques that Sarah had demonstrated were eye-opening. Jackson began to notice patterns in conversations and interactions that he had never paid attention to before. The way certain personnel steered discussions toward operational details that weren't directly relevant to their duties. How some individuals seemed unusually interested in deployment schedules and security procedures. Williams knocked on Jackson's office door, carrying reports that needed to be reviewed for the next day's operations. As his sergeant entered, Jackson found himself studying Williams' behavior with new eyes, looking for any signs of the suspicious patterns that Sarah had taught him to recognize. "Sir, I've been thinking about some of the equipment requests we've been processing lately," Williams said, settling into his usual chair. "Some of the justifications seem unusual for routine operations." Jackson felt his pulse quicken. Williams had noticed the same patterns that had initially alerted Sarah to the infiltration network. The sergeant's observational skills were clearly better than Jackson had realized, which raised both opportunities and concerns for the ongoing investigation. "What kind of unusual justifications?" Jackson asked, trying to keep his voice casual while gathering intelligence about Williams' observations. "Well, Johnson's request for the advanced communication equipment, for instance. The capabilities he specified go well beyond what our unit typically needs for standard deployments. And Morrison from Communications has been asking questions about our unit's radio protocols that seem outside his normal responsibilities." Jackson realized that Williams had independently identified the same suspicious activities that Sarah's sophisticated intelligence analysis had revealed. The sergeant's natural observational skills and attention to detail had allowed him to recognize patterns that Jackson had completely missed. "You're right to notice those things," Jackson said carefully. "I've been getting guidance from higher up about enhanced security protocols for equipment requests. There are concerns about operational security that require additional scrutiny of certain types of requests." Williams nodded, but Jackson could see that the sergeant was putting together pieces of a puzzle that went beyond routine security concerns. Williams' intelligence and attention to detail made him a valuable potential asset for the investigation, but they also made him a security risk if he wasn't properly briefed on the classified aspects of the operation. "Sir, is there something specific I should be watching for?" Williams asked. "The enhanced protocols suggest that there might be security threats that go beyond routine procedural concerns." Jackson found himself at a crossroads. Williams had demonstrated exactly the kind of observational skills and analytical thinking that would be valuable for the counterintelligence operation. But bringing Williams into the investigation would require revealing classified information and expanding the circle of personnel who knew about the ongoing espionage activities. "Let me discuss your observations with the appropriate personnel," Jackson replied. "In the meantime, I need you to continue documenting any unusual equipment requests or behavior patterns you notice. Don't take any direct action, but keep detailed records of anything that seems out of the ordinary." After Williams left, Jackson contacted Sarah through secure channels to report the conversation. Williams's independent identification of suspicious activities confirmed the intelligence analysis, but it also created new complications for maintaining operational security while the investigation continued. 2 weeks after Johnson received the modified communication equipment, Sarah's intelligence operation reached its dramatic conclusion. The armory had been transformed into a sophisticated command center, with Commander Hayes, federal investigators, and senior intelligence personnel monitoring multiple surveillance feeds that showed the espionage network's final hours of operation. Jackson stood beside Sarah's workstation, watching in amazement as 18 months of careful intelligence gathering culminated in a coordinated takedown operation. The modified equipment had worked exactly as planned, recording every transmission Johnson made and leading investigators to a network of foreign operatives that extended far beyond their initial suspicions. "Johnson is making his final transmission now," Sarah reported, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were witnessing. On her monitor, they could see real-time intercepts of coded messages being sent to handlers outside the country, along with detailed intelligence about American military operations that Johnson had been gathering for months. Commander Hayes leaned over Sarah's shoulder, studying the intelligence data that was streaming across her screens. "Agent Martinez, this operation has exceeded every expectation we had when we first identified suspicious activities. The scope of the intelligence compromise is far greater than anyone realized." Jackson watched the coordinated arrests taking place across the base through security camera feeds. Johnson was being detained in his barracks, his casual confidence finally cracking as federal agents presented him with evidence of his espionage activities. Morrison was arrested in the communications center, where he had been attempting to destroy files that documented his unauthorized access to classified systems. The most shocking arrest was Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Hendricks from the intelligence section, whose involvement in the network had only been discovered through the communications intercepted from Johnson's modified equipment. Hendricks had been using her position to provide the espionage network with intelligence about American counterintelligence operations, effectively helping foreign agents avoid detection while they gathered Sensitive military information, 17. Arrests total, Sarah. Reported to Commander Hayes. The network was much more extensive than our initial analysis suggested. They had operatives at multiple levels of the command structure, from enlisted personnel to senior officers. Jackson shook his head in disbelief. I worked with these people every day. Hendricks briefed our unit just last month on security procedures. How could I have been so completely unaware of what was happening? Sarah turned from her monitors to address Jackson directly. Lieutenant, your lack of awareness actually played a crucial role in the success of this operation. The fact that you didn't recognize the sophisticated activities happening around you made you the perfect asset for gathering intelligence about the network. She pulled up Jackson's behavioral profile, which now showed a very different analysis than the one he had seen during their first encounter. Your predictable behavior patterns and focus on routine procedures provided perfect cover for our investigation. Johnson trusted you precisely because you seemed unaware of the larger intelligence picture. Commander Hayes nodded approvingly. Agent Martinez is correct. Your role in this operation was far more valuable than you realize. The intelligence you gathered about Johnson's activities was crucial to identifying the full scope of the network. Jackson felt a strange mixture of pride and embarrassment. His earlier dismissive attitude toward Sarah and his inability to recognize sophisticated intelligence operations had inadvertently made him an effective counterintelligence asset. The same blind spots that had caused him to underestimate Sarah's capabilities had helped expose a major espionage network. What happens now? Jackson asked, watching as the last of the suspected operatives were led away in restraints. Sarah began shutting down her monitoring systems. The immediate crisis finally over after months of careful investigation. Now we begin the damage assessment. We need to determine exactly what intelligence was compromised and how it might affect ongoing operations. She paused, looking at the data that documented the scope of the intelligence breach. The network had access to deployment schedules, communication protocols, and security procedures for over 18 months. That's a significant compromise that will require extensive counterintelligence measures to address. Commander Hayes gathered the final intelligence reports, preparing to brief senior leadership about the operation's successful conclusion. Agent Martinez, your work on this investigation has been exemplary. The sophistication of your analysis and the operational security you maintained throughout the investigation were crucial to its success. Jackson realized that he was witnessing the end of Sarah's cover assignment. Her role as an armory manager had been so effective that even he had been completely fooled. But the success of the counterintelligence operation meant that her cover was no longer necessary. Sir, Jackson addressed Commander Hayes, I have to ask about Sergeant Williams. He independently identified many of the same suspicious patterns that led to this investigation. His observational skills were remarkable. Hayes considered this information carefully. Williams will be debriefed about his observations and considered for advanced intelligence training. Personnel with his analytical capabilities are valuable assets for future operations. Sarah smiled at Jackson's recommendation. Williams' natural ability to recognize unusual patterns would make him an excellent candidate for intelligence work. His observations about equipment requests and behavioral anomalies showed exactly the kind of thinking we need in counterintelligence operations. As the command center was being dismantled, Jackson found himself reflecting on how dramatically his understanding of military operations had changed over the past few weeks. His encounter with Sarah had revealed layers of complexity in routine activities that he had never imagined. Every supply transaction, every equipment request, every casual conversation carried potential intelligence value that he had been completely unaware of. Agent Martinez, Jackson said as Sarah packed up her sophisticated monitoring equipment, I owe you an apology for my behavior during our first encounter. I made assumptions about your capabilities based on your apparent position, and those assumptions were completely wrong. Sarah paused in her packing to look at him directly. Lieutenant, your assumptions were exactly what I needed to maintain my cover. In intelligence work, being underestimated is often an advantage. She gestured toward the monitors that had revealed the extent of the espionage network. The same assumptions that caused you to dismiss my capabilities also caused Johnson and his associates to underestimate the sophistication of our investigation. They never suspected that routine supply operations were actually cover for counterintelligence activities. Jackson realized that his Transformation during this operation went far beyond simply learning to recognize intelligence activities. He had discovered that his assumptions about people's capabilities based on their apparent positions were not just wrong, they were dangerous. The supply clerk he had dismissed as incompetent had actually been one of the most sophisticated intelligence operatives he had ever encountered. Commander Hayes approached them with final instructions. "Lieutenant Jackson, you'll be receiving a commendation for your role in this operation. Your cooperation and assistance were instrumental in exposing this network." He paused, emphasizing the importance of what he was about to say. However, all details of this operation remain classified at the highest levels. The methods we used and the intelligence we gathered must be protected to ensure the success of future operations. As Jackson left the armory for what he knew would be the last time as Sarah's unofficial partner in the investigation, he carried with him a completely transformed understanding of how intelligence operations worked. The woman he had initially dismissed as a mere supply clerk had taught him lessons about observation, analysis, and operational awareness that would influence his military career for years to come. The espionage network that had operated undetected for 18 months had been completely dismantled, but Jackson knew that the real victory was the knowledge that sophisticated intelligence operations were happening all around him, conducted by people whose true capabilities were far greater than their apparent positions suggested. He would never again make the mistake of dismissing someone based on assumptions about what their job title indicated about their qualifications or importance.